Welcome to the Not Yet Now podcast. We're back, Brandon.
Yeah.
We're in awkward seating arrangement. Right?
Yeah, it's weird. I don't know. You always say look with your eyes, but not with your whole head, so you stay in the mic.
Typically, we're across the room, but we're going to do an interview today. We have someone that we're bringing on who we've interacted with his work quite a bit. Yes. Dr. Carl Trueman wrote Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He wrote an easier version of that book called
Strange New World.
Strange New World. And his most recent book is To Change All Worlds. We wanted to start with a little bit of a promo on this one before we get into it, because it will get a little heady. And there's
some assumptions of what we're talking about that we don't fully go into.
Correct. But I want you to stay through the end, because we have very practical application of what this means for the church. But maybe you could talk a little bit about why, because he's going to talk about something called critical theory, which we've mentioned on the podcast before. I think we had an entire podcast on it in terms of epistemology. How do we know what we know? And so we've unpacked some of these ideas. Dr. Trueman is obviously an academic. He's very sharp. But why? And what does this mean for us today?
Yeah, because on one level, you can engage with these ideas on Twitter, and it's kind of this red meat, and you throw out terms like woke or critical theory. And it's this thing that's out there that we know is very destructive and has real-world consequences. But for many of us, including myself, and I've mentioned this before, it's a very personal thing. Mm-hmm. Because I was a part of a Southern Baptist church plant from 2015 to 2020. And the Southern Baptist was wrestling with this idea of, okay, are the critical theories a helpful tool that we should use, or are they just evil, wicked, an abomination that we should reject? And so I'm in the church that I've mentioned before, and I believe that underneath everything that happened, sure, there were personalities, sure, there was sin, but these ideas were so explosive that it really did rip our church apart.
And whether the people in your church had even heard of these ideas, maybe they
That's
never.
Right. We never sat around as a church saying, well, I believe critical theory and Marx and Marcuse on this, and the other guy's like, no, Marcuse was wrong on that. We never used that language. No. They had just infiltrated and changed our view of the world and set these expectations and these visions that ended up diverging.
Yeah, but going into this discussion, when you hear the word or the term critical theory, this has everything to do with the conversation right now that's happening around DEI. You've probably heard about that: diversity, equity, and inclusion. The transgender ideology, woke. We've all heard the term woke. It's been thrown out there so much, mm-hmm. And so like these ideas keep coming up. They're not going away. This is a big cultural conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Trump issued an executive order abolishing DEI departments within federal agency.
Yes, and so our goal is let's go back and examine the underlying philosophies that helped even shape a lot of this conversation. And we're not. I think that's where Dr. Trueman's work is very helpful. His book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, really, we read it right after COVID, right during COVID, rather. And it was extremely well done. It's a lot of meat. But I'm telling you that now because I want you to hang in here. It has everything to do with the Gospel of Mark. We're taking, I told you we would take breaks when we had a guest on. But what we're doing in the Gospel of Mark is we want to see the gospel of the kingdom. And what that means is it's an embodied spirituality that Christ brought. It's not out there. It's not something that's way away from us. So we need to understand and have conversations about what are the ideas and the philosophies that have shaped Western thought, where we live, and particularly what does it mean to be a human? Things like that. How do we know what we know? Epistemology. All these questions. We need to go back. We need to look at the underlying philosophy. So this will be a little bit heavy, but I want to just encourage you guys to stick around and stick through it, because at the end of the podcast we are going to get into real world application.
Well, yeah, and there's two things that are true in this: that ideas do have consequences. So what we believe matters, and the ideas that gain traction in society radically reshape society in the image of those ideas. And so to a degree, we have to keep up with these things. And the ultimate hope is not our ability to hold on to ideas and to make sense of every new, ever-changing topic. Our ultimate hope is Christ himself, but on this earth, it is the embodied church. It's the incarnation that lives on as we come together as a body around the body of Christ. And in many ways, that just simplifies the whole task because we can live with presence in those spaces, and it shields us from the harmful impact of the ideas, and it offers a beautiful hope of a greater reality.
Yeah, that's good. So I hope you guys find this encouraging. I hope you find it edifying. Again, stick around past the first few segments. We do get into some meat, but at the end of it, I think we'll tie it all up with a nice, beautiful bow. So with that being said, let's take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll be with Dr. Trueman. Well, welcome back to the Not Yet Now podcast. We have a very special guest today, not in studio, Dr. Carl Trueman out of Grove City College. Dr. Trueman, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be on. Thanks for inviting me.
You were a little bit late. You said you got stuck in the snow.
I did, yes. Western Pennsylvania hazard this time of year.
So to our friends in Louisiana, we say you have an excuse if you get stuck in the snow. If you're in the mountains of North Carolina, which we are, or Pennsylvania, we don't have. But you didn't have the 4-wheel drive, so it wasn't.
No, my wife insisted, would you believe, unreasonably, on using her car today. And my car is a small sporty number with rear-wheel drive, which is not. It's designed for hairpin bends. It is not designed for more than a quarter of an inch of snow.
I love it.
The videos I'm seeing come out of Louisiana, instead of taking their cars out, they're just using the airboats to ride across the snow, which is pretty awesome.
And they were ice skating on Canal Street in New Orleans, which I thought, wow, that's interesting. But, that's never happened. Well, look, we're excited about today. Our podcast, we've been talking a whole lot about epistemology, anthropology. We interacted with your work back in 2020, coming out of COVID, entering in kind of the depths of COVID, all of the cultural division that was happening with BLM, the gender ideology, of just all the things, right? And you wrote a book that came out at the end, I believe, at the end of 2020, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which means I guess you were writing it well before in advance, right?
I remember it was actually my financial advisor dropped me a note in August of 2020 and said, the conditions are perfect for marketing your book. Completely random, because I wrote the book because I was interested in the topic. I did not expect the stars to align quite as they did.
Yeah.
So everybody else's suffering actually was a great marketing opportunity.
Yeah. So we were wondering, are you a prophet? Because I mean that was pretty prophetic, your writing. So, but no, you started with a question in the book, which on the surface seems provocative, but you weren't trying to be provocative. You were really asking the question of how is the statement that I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, how is that not laughable and taken serious in 2020? And I guess when you were writing the book was even before that, when just years before, that would have been, a short few years before, that would have been unthinkable. And so your book was addressing really this whole movement that we call critical theory, and you were answering that question at how do we arrive here culturally. And I remember you said, well, it depends on how far back you want to go. You started with Rousseau, but what got you into this whole? What interested you to even dive into this so early?
Yeah, well, at the time I was teaching when I started thinking about the work. I was teaching at a seminary, so I was training a lot of men for ministry, and I was also a part-time pastor myself, and I became aware as pastor that the way that I thought about a lot of things, which seemed to me to be self-evident, particularly in matters of sexuality, sexual morality, and also what we now say called gender theory, though most of my congregants would not have had that term available to them. I was aware that there was this big generational divide between people of my age, and I was sort of mid-40s and above, and people below the age of sort of 30. It seemed to me that there were a lot of people, a lot of Christians under the age of 30 who genuinely wanted to follow biblical teaching, but didn't find the Bible teaching quite as obviously things about gender, things about sexuality, as people of my generation did. And I was intrigued, what has gone on that has reshaped, if you like, the intuitions of the younger generation in such a way that the question, what is a woman, moves from being a no-brainer to being a brainer. What has gone on? That kind of thing is so dramatic. It's unlikely to just have resulted from somebody putting up a podcast yesterday. There have to be macro, big scale changes taking place within our culture over a long period of time that have prepared us for this moment. So it was really one of the big drivers of it was pastoral concern and intellectual curiosity. I was thinking, if I can find out what's going on here, then it's easier to develop pastoral strategies, or it's easier to address this kind of thing from the pulpit.
Yeah, well, for me, these are more than just ideas to interact with in a book. I lived this in a very personal way. So I moved from a large church to be a part of a church plant here in Asheville. And when I was at the large church, we had tons of staff. We were interacting with ideas and keeping up on cultural movements all the time. But when I moved here, I really hit the ground running. So we're trying to plant a church. We're trying to survive. We're trying to grow. And I'm just busy doing the work of the church. And so all of a sudden 2020 comes, and it completely, really in an embarrassing way, it catches me off guard. I did not see it coming. I knew ideas about the multi-ethnic church and diversity and those kind of things, but I just did not see it coming. So now you marry that with COVID. And so there's these lightning bolt issues, and we're supposed to be separate, never embodied together, talking about them. And it just became really difficult to know where to go and where to look and what questions. And I just think of the average Christian out there. How are we supposed to keep up with this ever-changing landscape of these ideas hitting? I mean, you go back to Rousseau and you're doing this academic study, but most people, they're going to their job, they're watching news, they're reading a few articles, and they're going to bed. So how do we keep up with these things?
It's a really good question. And I think, part of the problem that you're pointing to there is this stuff seems to be on the surface so complicated.
Yeah.
There's race issues, there's gender issues, there's sexuality issues. The old politics doesn't go away either. So there seems on the surface to be chaos. What I would say to your typical Christian is this, don't play whack-a-mole with these problems. If you go after them individually, it's going to take a lot of time, and it's actually not going to be that effective. What I encourage Christians to do is let's drill down. Let's think, what is there something, or are there a few things that lie behind all of this chaos? If we can boil it down to 2 or 3 things, then we can address those things, and we can use that as a positive base. So that would be one thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is this: the truth is the truth. And one of the great things about the truth is it doesn't matter what the falsehood is. The truth will expose it.
Yeah.
Now, take an example of gay marriage, which popped up. My own circles are Presbyterian circles. We subscribe to this document called the Westminster Confession of Faith, which covers a lot of basic Christian doctrine and Christian ethics. And there's a section in the Westminster Confession of Faith that deals with marriage. Now, the Westminster Confession of Faith was put together in the middle of the 17th century. None of the guys involved in putting together the Westminster Confession of Faith ever thought that gay marriage would be a thing. It's not even crossing their horizon as something to sort of think through. But what the Westminster Confession does is it sets forth positive truth of marriage. And what that means is that any false alternative is automatically excluded. So actually, the Westminster Confession of Faith does exclude gay marriage, even though it never crossed the horizon of the man who wrote it. Why? Because it's a good, positive statement of what marriage is. And by implication, that allows you to recognize what marriage is not. Now, put those two things together, the drilling down, and is there something big that lies behind all of this? And then, can we positively express that in a way that means we may still get caught a bit off guard by developments, but we've got a good foundation for responding. I would say that the big thing that lies behind much of the chaos we saw in 2020 and beyond is an understanding of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
That's the big issue. What does it mean to be a human being? And I would say to your typical Christian out there, if you want to focus on one thing at the moment and dig deep and read on this one thing. Think about what it means to be human. And I would recommend, the little book by C.S. Lewis. Maybe some of your listeners, they're not big book readers. Well, there's a little book by C.S. Lewis called The Abolition of Man. And it's just 3 lectures that he gave in, I think, 1942, 1943. You could sit and read it in an hour and a half, even if you don't really read books. It wouldn't take you very long. That book is a brilliant primer in what's going on in the modern world relative to a chaotic understanding of what it means to be human. It's over 80 years old, so he's not dealing with every issue we deal with today. But what he is doing is he's giving you a great vision of what it means to be human. And that, I think, many of your listeners would find that to provide a great starting point or a great foundation. If we just look at the chaos, we're liable to panic or despair. How can we possibly grab hold of all of the tentacles of this giant octopus that's there?
Yeah.
If you grab hold of 2, there are still 6 flailing around. But what you can do is say, okay, I can't deal with all the symptoms, but let me drill down into the cause and let me get a good understanding of what it means to be human, so that when some new idea comes along, I can ask the question, does this enhance what it means to be human, or does it detract or destroy what it means to be human? And that will be very, very helpful.
That's good.
In facing ethical questions that you and I probably can't even dream of at this point in our wildest nightmares, because who knows what's around the next corner. But I do know if you have a positive grasp of what it means to be human, you are well placed to develop a response strategy to it.
Well, that's interesting, because that's exactly what we were going to name this podcast initially, is what is human. In fact, we have a bunch of documents we put together of resources we wanted to use, and that was the question that we were coming to as well. I mean, how do we anchor this back into the Imago Dei? What does it mean to be human? You address these issues as if they're issues, or as if they're moral issues, almost like they're separate. Like the term moral values, and what are your values? But when I hear that a lot of times in culture, I'm hearing almost like it's separated out from our humanity and our teleology and how we were designed to be. And so we've been exploring that same thing. So it's interesting that you say that. And what we're looking for really, because a lot of these, you talk about Hegel's dialect, and you talk about Karl Marx a lot, Herbert Marcuse, and all of the philosophers. Your work, and because you also wrote a layman's version of that book called, was it Strange New World?
Strange New World, yeah.
Strange New World, which I did not read that, but we read the first one, and then you had another book that we've started that came out, I believe in October, on critical theory, that we both started, but you actually, Brandon may have finished it. But your work is more of a historical look at the philosophical kind of underpinnings of this. And so, we were going to ask the question, but what is that through line throughout the whole argument? And I think it is the question of what does it mean to be human, which we would argue that the Christian faith and it has a unique answer for this that actually solves our dilemma, right?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the Christian faith teaches that we're made in the image of God. That has various implications. One of which is that we are dependent creatures. We're dependent upon God. And I would also say, when you look at Genesis, it's not good for man to be alone. We're also dependent upon each other. So that immediately strikes at the heart of one of the great modern myths, that human beings are autonomous. We're not autonomous. Actually, we're dependent creatures. And I say to students all the time, compared to a lot of other animals, we're remarkably dependent for a remarkably long time.
Yeah.
Most parents still worry about their children, even when their kids are in their 20s and 30s to some extent. Yeah. Secondly, I think the Imago Dei tells us, and you've already used this word on the podcast, it gives us a teleology. Mm-hmm. We're not simply created to invent our own meaning or our own ends. Now, we do some of that, of course, because, you have a different career path to the one that I have. You've been to different colleges. We do choose freely a lot of things. And as human beings, there is a lot in our lives that is unique to us.
Yeah.
But at root, we're made to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Quote the words of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. We have a telos. We have a supernatural end in God. And I would also argue we have certain natural ends as human beings. We are to go forth, to multiply, to subdue the earth. None of these things in any which way we choose, all in accordance with the way that God has laid them out in the Bible, in order that they too end up terminating in the glorification of God and the enjoyment of him forever. But being made in the image of God gives us a telos and an end. And you might say, well, how does that apply to some of the most pressing issues of our day? Well, I would say, think about the trans issue. And to go back to that statement, I'm a woman born in a man's body. I would say that human beings are body and soul. The body and soul is a unity. And the body has a telos too. That I am, to some extent, the end of my body. I'm not some spooky thing that inhabits my body like a spaceman inhabits a spacesuit. We make a distinction between the spaceman and the spacesuit. I think I am my body in a key and important way. And this is why Christianity believes in resurrection, for example. I genuinely believe when I die, my soul goes straight to be with the Lord. But it's not fully me at that point. It's only on the day of resurrection, when the soul rejoins the body, that it's completely me.
Yeah.
Because I am a body, and my body gives me a certain distinct teleology. Even think of that command, go forth and multiply. In that human end, men and women's bodies play different roles. They have different, we might say, immediate ends that culminate in the one end that they share, and that is multiplying. So I would say, when you have a good biblical anthropology grounded in the image of God, we actually do have the resources for starting to think through why some things that we may sort of intuitively think are wrong, but can't quite put our finger on why they're wrong. We have good grounds, I think, for being able to say, no, now I know why it's actually wrong to say I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, because that involves a fundamental redefinition of what it means to be human, because it transforms my ends.
Yeah. So let's do this. So your work has been it's been a historical analysis, a philosophical analysis of what's known in pop culture as critical theory, or critical race theory, critical theory. How does critical theory, well, first of all, give us a 30,000-foot overview of what it is, where it came from, and then how and how does it differ from a biblical anthropology? What does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to acquire knowledge? How do we acquire knowledge in that framework? Can you give us a 30,000-foot overview?
It's hard to give a 30,000-foot overview, but I'll give it a try. Critical theory is a term used really to refer to a school of thought, and now schools of thought, that emerged particularly in Germany in the 1920s, 1930s, drawing on some German philosophers, Hegel, Marx. Many of your listeners may have heard of. Hegel was in some ways the kind of brain behind Marx, though the more ambiguous figure than Marx in a lot of ways. Critical theory essentially, I'll tell you what it does. It encourages people to be suspicious about the way things are, and to see the way things are as actually manipulative. Powerful people, powerful groups are manipulating us to think that the way things are is the way things should and must be, in order to keep us in positions of subordination. Mm-hmm. So if you think about critical race theory, critical race theorists would say, look at the way that even the civil rights movement, which is presented as this liberation of people of color, but dig below the surface. What it really is doing is everything's remaining much the same. The underlying system, particularly for some Marxists, of course, the capitalist system, remains the same. The injustices remain. There are kind of little bones thrown to the crowd here and there to keep them happy, but the underlying injustices of the system remain in place. And critical theory strives to provide people with a set of tools to see through that deception with a view to overthrowing the system. So it's not simply cultural criticism. It's not simply a case of saying, people behave this way because culture shaped them this way. It's an attempt to say people behave this way because culture shaped them this way, and the only way to respond to this is to overthrow the culture. Mm-hmm. So it's a revolutionary movement from that perspective. Where it ties into the anthropological question is this. It really wants to deny that there is such a thing as human nature, or at least to claim that if there is such a thing as human nature, it has not been realized in history yet. It's something that lies in the future. And it would say that, when Trueman sits on these podcasts and he talks about human nature in the way he does, he's manipulating you. He's presenting a way of looking at the world that suits him, that keeps him in his position of influence on authority, that keeps him comfortable.
So everything's a power dynamic.
Everything comes down to a power dynamic. Yeah. And really, even the idea of human nature, as I say, becomes a manipulative tool for keeping people in their place. When Trueman says human nature is embodied and our bodies have a certain shape and end, no, they don't. Our bodies are just stuff. Trueman's conning you there in order to make sure that his tribe, his group, his class stay on top, and you guys who disagree with him are kept underneath.
Yeah. So how would a critical theorist respond to this, just based on your work? So you look at the West and, Christianity, William Wilberforce, he stood up against slavery. Then you have the Civil War in the 1860s, and finally we ended slavery in this country. Then you have Martin Luther King coming from a Christian perspective in the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. It seems like our institutions are growing and getting better and putting to death these things we don't like. And how does the critical theorist respond to that in light of the advances the West has made?
Well, if you're a Marxist critical theorist, you give the sort of answer I gave a few moments ago and say, yes, but capitalism still remains in place. People are still manipulated. Maybe it isn't people of color anymore, but it's the working class, or it's homosexuals, or it's transgender people. The basic corrupt system remains in place and remains manipulative. And of course, there's strongly, particularly in the Marxist strand of critical theory, strongly utopian. So we might say anything short of utopia is regarded as ineradicably corrupt. So, okay, you've got the Civil War. Well, we all know the Civil War didn't end racism. The Civil War didn't bring people of color into a position of equal parity with those who'd formerly been the slave masters. But you and I would say, yeah, but it's an improvement. It's a step in the right direction. They would say, no, it isn't. It's still not utopia. The oppression simply takes a different form, maybe an even more manipulative form, because people think they're free, but actually they're not free at all. So that's how a critical theorist would respond. And I think for most of us, that is intuitive nonsense. Yeah. The problem is, how do you persuade these people who have utterly different premises from which they're working? How do you persuade them that the beliefs they're holding are nonsense?
Yeah, I think of the G.K. Chesterton quote when he was asked what's wrong with the world. He's answered it in two different ways. In one way, he said, I am. I'm the problem. Another one, he said, we don't have a vision for what's right. Does the critical theorist ever turn on themselves in that way and say, I'm the problem? If I could just fix myself, I could embody this in a way that offers something good to the world? Or is it always the other?
It's interesting. I think it depends on which strand of critical theory you look at. If you're looking at the sort of the old traditional Frankfurt School Marxist kind that I address in my book, then you're really dealing with people who do think that utopia is possible. They don't know exactly what it looks like because it's utopia, but they have this belief that if you tear everything down, if you criticize everything and tear everything down, utopia will emerge from the ashes. And there's a little bit of taste of this in the Black Lives Matter. I don't know if it's still the case. I haven't checked their website for a couple of years now. But when you originally would go to their website and look at their manifesto, the manifesto was fascinating in that it was very clear about what they were opposed to. They're opposed to the police, for example. You've got to dismantle the police. As soon as you get into, well, what are they looking for positively? The language got very, I would say, sort of poetic. It was a kind of, well, we won't need the police because, we'll all be living in a village. yeah, well, what does that look like? I grew up in a village. We actually had a policeman, who kept law and order there. So I think on the Marxist side, there is this idea that, yeah, we can fix things. And those of us who have, this special knowledge that we can see through the deceptions, we are part of the solution, not part of the problem. There's another strand of critical theory that really emerges in the 1960s, and associated with particularly with a French figure, a very wicked man on a personal level, though quite a brilliant thinker, called Michel Foucault. And I think Foucault, in some ways, would be a more honest critical. If you were to say to Foucault, yes, but your theories, are they not just manipulative power bids as well? I think Foucault would say, yeah, they are.
Yeah.
And Foucault, in some ways, a very pessimistic thinker, in that with Foucault, it becomes impossible really to resist power.
Mm-hmm.
One can only play the power game. And there I think, I wouldn't want to put words in his mouth, but I wonder if he was sitting here today and you'd say to him, but isn't your way of thinking part of the problem? He might shrug his shoulders and say, sure, what you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Like almost admitting that this is a power dynamic and we want control. And
yeah,
this is a fight to the finish. I mean, you had mentioned in one of your books that going back to Marx, that Marx had essentially predicted that the proletariat would rise up and end up realizing that they were oppressed and end up gaining their power back. But the Industrial Revolution came along and capitalism won. So they had to reemerge, which is where the critical theory came into play. Looking at where we're at culturally right now, I mean, you wrote your book. We also read Christopher Rufo's book. I don't know if did you read that at all?
Yeah.
And his was more yours was more of like a history of the philosophy. His was more of a history of just the players, particularly with Marcuse and then Angela Davis and Eldridge Cleaver. I was surprised. I didn't realize the violent history of the movement in the U.S., that there were over 40 assassinations and murders associated with some of this. And I was very shocked to read Eldridge Cleaver. I think he was a self-proclaimed rapist and in the form of social justice. And so that was shocking to me to see that the roots of that. But Rufo and these guys have obviously had quite a bit of influence in the current administration. And it does seem like there is a lot of policy changes happening now.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, one, do you think this is defeated for the time period, number one? And number two, if it is, how does it reemerge?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I think only time will tell what the real significance of the re-election of Donald Trump is. I think at a minimum, it represents a definite and I think good reaction against the sort of the self-righteous hectoring that has been coming from real progressives over the last 4 or 5 years that seems to have driven a lot of policy. It's very clear that Trump, I think, made inroads into a lot of people who would not be natural Republican territory, but are just fed up of being badgered by wealthy progressives and allowing that to set the agenda. So I do think we're seeing a healthy reaction against that setting in. Whether it's, as a Christian, human beings are sinful.
Yeah.
They're sinful on the right and they're sinful on the left. Who knows where it will reemerge. It's been interesting to me how much of the language of critical theory has emerged in some radical right-wing quarters over the last 12 to 18 months. And it's been interesting to me who on the radical right was kind of cautious about criticizing critical race theory's basic principles, because I think critical theorists right and left, the revolutionaries right and left, they understand there are certain commonalities between their approaches. For example, George Lukács, one of the early Marxist critical theorists, would say, it's okay to lie, providing it has providing it pushes history in the right direction.
Yeah, the ends justify the means.
Yeah. Truth is not correspondence theory of truth, where you say, hey, the cat is on the mat, which is true if the cat is on the mat, or not true if the cat is not on the mat. Truth is a statement that pushes the process of history towards the the Marxist utopia. And I see some of that with some of the radicals on the right now. Is that, hey, we saw it with the Ohio Haitians eating cats kind of thing. I remember seeing one tweet from somebody saying, hey, it doesn't really matter if it's true or not. It's getting the discussion going in the right direction. And I think, wow, George Lukács has risen from his grave and reappeared on the right of American politics.
Yeah, the image is more important than the idea itself.
Yeah. So it will be interesting to see. I have a somewhat naive belief that American politics over the long term always tilts back towards the center. Not been much evidence of that over the last 10, 15 years, but we may be beginning to see the tilting back to the center, and maybe critical theory will fall into abeyance for a generation or so. But I wouldn't bet the house on that.
Yeah. Well, why do you think these ideas are so attractive? Not just to the world, but to many Christians. A buddy of mine follows someone on Instagram, and he was saying in back-to-back posts that this lady's liking. One is Sadie Robertson. And the next is someone who's quoting Angela Davis. So just the enduring impact of Marx generation after generation now, in spite of its like utter failures, cataclysmic failures. Why does it keep there must be something that is close to true, or a question that it's asking that we're drawn into. What do you think that is?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of factors in that. Just pick on a couple. I think there are certainly certain analogies between biblical teaching and some of the claims of critical theory. And I think of that passage in Isaiah where Isaiah talks about the man who goes out and he chops down a tree, and he chops the tree into two pieces. And one half he carves into an idol and he bows down and worships it, and the other half he kindles a fire with and he cooks his dinner. And Isaiah says, or the Lord says to Isaiah, he never asks the question, why do I do this? And to me, that's very akin to a sort of critical theoretical criticism, saying, hang on a minute, the way you live your life is incoherent. It's incoherent. We could go to Romans 1, where Paul talks there about the suppression of the truth through our unrighteousness. Again, that sounds kind of like what early critical theorists would call false consciousness, when you believe something's true and you follow it as truth, even though it's harming you. So I think critical theorists have on one level, they have a handle on the fact that there is a lot of manipulation in human relationships. So that, I think, makes them superficially attractive to some Christians. Secondly, I think that the other thing that makes them attractive to us as fallen humans is it's destructive. It's powerful and it's destructive. And there's nothing like smashing stuff up to attract a crowd. I teach Reformation at Grove at times, and I always make the joke, why is the Reformation so successful? Well, it involves recruiting gangs of young men to smash up stained glass windows. I said, nobody is going to lose if you say to young men, hey, come and smash up a church. Now, that's a simplistic take, but it's part of the truth.
Yeah.
It's part of the truth. And I think, Christians, we too are attracted to destructive ideologies, particularly just destructive ideologies that often dress themselves up in language that resonates with our moral stands. When you use the language of justice, that strikes a deep chord with many Christians. We don't want to live in an unjust society.
Yeah.
So there's a superficial aesthetic attractiveness to the way critical theory presents itself as well.
Yeah, I would argue too that it's a lot easier to negate something than to build something.
Yeah.
I know that in your book, when you talk about Hegel, it was all about this negation, and that the consciousness comes through this constant negation. And I was thinking about my children. I have 5 kids, and we had an instance when they were younger where my son Max had spent probably 7 days building this incredible Lego city. I mean, it was like incredible. This entire room was a Lego city. And he had put all this effort and creative energy into building this. And then his younger brother, Bear, comes in and within 15 seconds was able to negate and destroy the entire thing. And it took no work. So it's just pure unadulterated pleasure of destruction. And I thought, it's easier. It's so much easier to negate. And also in a culture that is, we're all filled with some level of virtue signaling in our own heart, that we want to elevate ourselves as high priests in culture, and we want to be seen as being on the right side of history. It's a lot easier for me to sit back and just negate. Mm-hmm. But then when you actually build something, then now you have to not only build, you have to protect, and it's more difficult that way. So I think by default, we do tend to move towards things that, of negation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the answer to many of the problems that the sort of below the surface that we're talking about here is it's kind of low energy.
Yeah.
Revolutions, a Marxist revolution, that's an exhilarating thing to be part of. That involves action. I'm committed to the idea that the solution is actually low energy. It's not as exciting. It involves, as a Christian, it involves the routine of daily Christian discipleship. You're talking there. You're talking about your kids. Raising kids, it takes a long time, and the results, if they come at all, are only ever incremental.
Yeah.
There are certain peak experiences, your kids' graduation, or you go to see them at a sports final and they're on the winning team. You do get those moments where there's that tremendous satisfaction, but those moments only come on the back of
the mundane.
Long, hard, mundane, unacknowledged, unglamorous slog.
We use the Nietzsche quote quite a bit, the long obedience in the same direction, and taking that and applying that to discipleship. It's that mundane, repetitive, liturgical life that's just that. I mean, we've both said it, like the most fundamental things in our own love of God is that it was that Sunday school class when we weren't even paying attention. We thought, it was the repetitive taking of the communion Sunday after Sunday. It was those things that formed us in such a powerful way, which is, I'd love for you to talk about a little bit about what we're doing in terms of local embodiment of this, because we would argue that this is really hard to get on from social media. That it has to be, experienced in a local community.
Yeah, well, this is why I particularly liked your book. Is I've read a lot of these books, interacted with a lot of podcasts and articles, and I remember I had a very distinct experience actually with his brother. We're sitting around a fire and we're talking about these ideas, having both read one of the books, and I walked away just rebel roused. I was angry. I felt scared. I felt like there was this enemy at the gate that was too big and I could never quite nail down. And I come to the end of your book, and it's just this beautiful hope. I'll just read it from page 225. This is what you say. You said, "This is where the church can refute critical theory. If we take the Marxist notion that humanity is something to be realized in the future, where the terms of being a free individual and belonging to a community will be overcome, then the church makes the claim that this is already realized in the here and now in the church itself. It is the inbreak of eschatological humanity into the present age." I walk away with that, not scared, but with a beautiful and just stable hope in what I have to live into and out of for the sake of the world.
Yeah, and I think that's something that Christians need to grasp. We live in an age where it can be very easy to despair because a lot of the things we hold in high esteem, and rightly hold in high esteem, are being trampled underfoot. And the levers of power are not held by people who have a particularly high view of the Christian gospel. So we can feel the cold air of contemporary culture in a lot of ways and be tempted to despair. But we need to remember that the church, I press this on the students all the time, the church is not just another community. The church is the body of Christ. There are supernatural promises attached to the church. The Lord's Supper is not just getting together and sharing some bread and some wine. There are promises attached to the Lord's Supper. And they're not spectacular as in, if you do this, then tomorrow all your problems are going to go away. But they're promises that attach to the body that what you're experiencing here and now, in all of its imperfections and all of its limitations, is a refreshing foretaste of what you will experience in eternity at the marriage of Christ and his bride, the church.
That's so good. What we're experiencing in our community here, which, as you know, Asheville is not. It's not a red territory at all. I mean, it's very progressive. I would somewhat argue maybe post-Christian culture here. But what we're experiencing in our local community, our local body of the church, which I love how you distinguish that from other communities because it is different, and there are promises attached to it. We are actually experiencing those promises that are centered around the table on Sunday morning, and we're seeing a lot of those who may have bought into the secular utopian vision. They started to see the cistern cracking, and we have no formal ministry for this type of ministry. The Holy Spirit literally is leading the charge here, but they are coming into the community of the church, and they're asking the question: wait, this is different. This is shockingly different, and Buddhism that we're a part of doesn't have that. What is this, or the New Age movement, or whatever it is that they're coming out of? We haven't experienced this before. And it gives us an opportunity to say, this is the manifold wisdom of God that Paul talks about in Ephesians, that you're experiencing. You're seeing God's kingdom on earth, and I think we've tried to how do we take this and replicate it? We don't have an answer for that because it's so localized in the community of a local parish model church that it's just difficult to replicate that because it's so viral. It's so, as you mentioned earlier, I forgot the word, low energy. In a good way, though, because there's a peace that is attached to it that transcends all understanding. So we're interested really in kind of exploring how does the local church really engage in this kingdom work? How do we engage in this in a way that paints a different vision for the good life, that reshapes the imagination? We use that term quite a bit. Like, how do we reshape the imagination that we share of what this good life is, and how do we live into those stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, we point there to, there are at least three aspects to the church that I think play into that. First of all, there's clearly a doctrinal aspect, a creedal aspect. Christians are defined by what they believe. And that's a constant theme through Paul's letters in the New Testament. But we're also defined, I think, by the way we worship. And, you use the term imagination there. And that's what makes the solution to today's issues tricky, because we're dealing with, as I sort of lay out in the book, we're not dealing so much with arguments as we're dealing with intuition shaped by our imaginations.
Yeah.
And how do you grip the imagination? Well, some of that can be done through teaching. Teaching the gospel can grip the imagination. But it's also powerfully done through worship. Music, words attached to music have a powerful effect on us.
Yeah.
The structure of the worship service. I don't think there's, I would not say there is a one size fits all in the worship service, but the worship service should in some way, through its dramatic rhythm, reflect the truths of the gospel. And then, of course, there's the community life, hospitality. And that, I think, is very powerful too, because if the thing that critical theory is trying to get at is, one of the things is, why do people treat each other as things and not as persons? One way to respond to that challenge is hospitality. When you open your home to somebody, or when you receive hospitality from somebody, then you're treating each other as persons, as human beings.
Yeah, because when did it? If you think about when did this really emerge in American culture, it was when we were shut out of each other's homes.
Yeah.
When life was lived virtually, when we weren't seeing each other face to face.
Yeah.
That seems to be when it exploded.
Yeah, and we all know that bodily presence is very significant, not just for spiritual things, but I made a comment to students just yesterday that I've been involved in a couple of face-to-face debates with people who would strongly disagree with my views. What's interesting about face-to-face discussions, however, are the temperature tends to go down, because you're actually, not always, but generally, because you're looking into each other's eyes, you're sharing jokes between speeches or engagement. You are recognizing each other as human beings because you are bodies in the presence of another body. If you're online debating somebody, I I'm not on Twitter, so I've never been engaged in a Twitter debate. But the ones I've witnessed, the temperature seems to go up. And I think one reason might be that if you're engaging somebody online, they are reduced simply to the views they express. And if you hate their views, then you must hate them.
That's good. Oh, yeah.
And so, take that back to the church. The embodiment of the church is an powerful part of our witness. It's not impossible to hate Christians when you're looking at them face to face. It takes something else to do that, though. It takes more backbone.
Yeah.
It takes more determination. And again, I think within Christian circles, that the more we actually engage face to face in real time and real space, the more we come to know each other and indeed come to know ourselves as human persons. So I think hospitality is a critical component. Most churches, I suspect, do one or two of those things well. Most churches like do the teaching well, maybe the worship well, but they neglect the hospitality. Or another church might great worship, great hospitality, but the teaching's a bit weak. I think it behooves us all to think critically about the churches we belong to and think, well, which of these three is our weak area? And let's work on that.
Yeah, Zach referred to this earlier in what he was saying. We've seen a lot of people from progressive Eastern spirituality backgrounds come to our church and be baptized into the gospel. And, for most of my life, and I still tilt this way, I thought what I had to do to defeat those ideologies was just to be smart enough, to be well-read. Carl Trueman's got another book. I got to digest this so that when asked a question, I can defeat. And there's obviously a place for that. You've given your life to academia and to writing books and to teaching students. But a guy came through about a month ago, and this guy is a world changer. He's in powerful circles. He lives in some of the biggest cities in the world and spends his whole life traveling in these circles, much more intelligent than I am. If I were to sit down and try to just argue him out of his ideas, I don't think I would have gone very far.
Right.
But he came to our church. He came to one of our worship services, our gatherings, and by the third song, he's on his knees weeping at what he's experiencing. And he said, I got to leave. I got to get on a plane, and I got to go to San Francisco, and then I'm going to be in Manhattan, and then I'm going to Thailand. He said, and all I want to do is just be here with you guys.
Makes perfect sense. I genuinely think that, embodiment, as I said earlier in the podcast, it's part of what makes us human. And human interaction, therefore, requires an acknowledgement of that.
One of Chesterton's other quotes is that Christianity hasn't been tried and found wanting. It's been tried and found too hard. I think it's easy to hide behind the ideas rather than to live out the truths that the gospel calls us to.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I'm an academic. I would say that the students that I have most influence on are not merely the students who sit in my classes. They're the students that my wife and I have round at our open houses for hospitality. That's what reinforces the reality of teaching. It's not just the classroom. It's also the relationships that are fostered outside of the classroom.
Yeah, which is why I love your work too. I mean, you say this in your most recent book, To Change All Worlds, and I love how you open this up. That this is not a polemic. This is not you're not coming up with an argument. I got you. This is not what you're doing. It's an open conversation. And your tone reflects that in your work, which I love because that's what. We're not watering down the truth in our church. We're not a quote-unquote seeker-friendly church. We're having real conversations. But when you're talking with someone who's been in Buddhism for 40 years, for example, man, that's a long conversation. If we can just get past the anger of the disagreement and have open dialogue, I think that's where it's at. And you just can't do that on Twitter or X. You can't do that on Facebook or Instagram even. I mean, that's done best in the context of a home. We would argue around a meal, preferably a nice meal, that where you've put the intentionality and you've opened up your home. Man, a lot of the anger, a lot of the guardrails go down when you love somebody in that way, and there's just this true manifestation of God's presence among us. And I think about what you said earlier about the resurrection of Christ and our resurrection and how that testifies to the importance of the physical body or even the incarnation of Christ. You think about, man, even in his very nature and how he condescends and how he comes to us, and this idea of presence. I mean, it's all throughout. Emmanuel, God with us. I think when the church reflects that, when the church reflects the idea of face-to-face presence, being near, coming near, drawing near, there's just something powerful about that really does speak to what I think all of us are looking for.
Yeah, yeah.
So, well, we want to thank you for coming on. That was great. We'd love to invite you back on at some point. Maybe you'll have to get you down here and speak to our church at some point too. We'd love to.
Would love to do that.
Love to host
I have
you.
a book coming out in the fall, actually, The Desecration of Man, which continues the bad news.
That sounds encouraging. Well, send us an advance copy of that, and then we will. We'd love to read it and then have you back on to discuss the content.
Thanks very much. Enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Trueman.
you.